The day they read her father's will, Nadya stood at the back of a room full of relatives she barely recognized, cousins in pressed suits, an aunt wearing pearls, a lawyer clearing his throat like he had somewhere better to be. She already knew something was wrong. She had known it the moment they called her that morning and told her to come alone. Her father was dead. The man who had spent 30 years building a business empire from nothing, a man whose name was on 3 buildings in this city, had finally run out of time. And now the people in this room were about to decide what happened to everything he left behind. Nadya was his only child, his biological daughter. She had his eyes, his stubborn jaw, his habit of drinking tea with too much sugar. She should have inherited everything. She got a house, not just any house. A condemned, half-collapsed, water-damaged wreck on the edge of town that nobody had lived in for 15 years. A house with a caved-in roof and walls that smelled like rot and forgotten things. And while Nadya stood there holding that single piece of paper, the deed to a ruin, her stepbrothers divided the rest of the estate between them. The business, the investments, the property portfolio, $43 million. The lawyer folded his briefcase shut. The cousins looked at the floor. Nobody met her eyes, but here is what none of them knew. Here is what nobody in that room could have imagined. That ruined house, that rotting, condemned, worthless piece of nothing they handed her like an insult. It was the most valuable thing her father ever owned. And before this story is over, those stepbrothers will lose everything they thought they stole. If this story already has your blood boiling, you are not alone. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this is only the beginning. What Nadya found in that house will change everything you think you know about this family. To understand what happened to Nadya, you have to understand the kind of man her father was. Solomon Adami grew up with nothing. Not the romanticized kind of nothing that people describe in speeches, actual nothing. A single room shared with 6 siblings in a neighborhood where the electricity went out more often than it stayed on. A mother who worked 3 jobs. A father he barely remembered. What Solomon had was his mind, and his hands, and a stubbornness that people would later call vision. By the time he was 32, he owned his first property. By 40, he had a construction company. By 55, he had built the kind of wealth that made people in his city speak his name with a particular kind of reverence. The reverence reserved for men who had made the impossible look effortless. He also had a complicated family. His first marriage to Nadya's mother, Grace, lasted 9 years. Grace was a quiet woman, a school teacher, someone who loved books and gardens and long silences. She and Solomon were happy in the way that people who come from very different worlds are sometimes happy, fully and briefly. She died of cancer when Nadya was 11 years old. Solomon never fully recovered. He threw himself into work the way grieving men sometimes do, building things, buying things, filling the silence with activity. And 3 years after Grace's death, he married again. Her name was Miriam. Miriam was polished in the way that expensive things are polished, beautiful on the surface and impossible to read underneath. She came with 2 sons from her first marriage, Roland, who was 17, and Felix, who was 15. Nadya was 14 when they moved in. She would spend the next decade learning exactly what kind of people she was living with. Roland was charming in public and cold in private. He had learned from a young age that the most effective way to get what you wanted was to make people feel like giving it to you was their own idea. He told jokes. He was generous at restaurants. He remembered birthdays, and he spent years systematically convincing Solomon that Nadya was difficult, unstable, ungrateful. Felix followed Roland's lead in everything. He was quieter, more cautious, the kind of person who watches from doorways. Miriam tied it all together. She was not cruel in the obvious ways. She never shouted. She never threatened. She simply, over many years with extraordinary patience, made herself indispensable to Solomon. She managed his schedule. She attended his meetings. She became the person he turned to when he was tired or uncertain, and she turned him slowly against his daughter. Not all at once, not with lies, at least not obvious ones, with suggestions, with sighs, with a carefully placed Solomon, I'm worried about Nadya, delivered at exactly the right moment. By the time Nadya was in her late 20s, she and her father were barely speaking. She had moved out at 22, built her own small life, tried not to think too hard about the distance between them. She had no idea how bad it had gotten. She had no idea what had been signed. She had no idea that 2 months before his death, Solomon Adami had called his lawyer and changed his will. Or so Roland and Felix believed. The weeks after the will reading were a blur for Nadya. She went through them the way you go through a car accident, aware that something catastrophic had happened, but still waiting for the full weight of it to land. Her father's business partners sent flowers and avoided her calls. The lawyer's office told her all correspondence would now go through Roland's legal team. Her childhood home, the big house on the hill where she had grown up, where her mother had planted roses along the back fence, was already being assessed for sale. She had the deed to a ruin and $3,200 in her savings account. The house was located on the eastern edge of the city, in a neighborhood that had once been fashionable and was now mostly forgotten. It was a 2-story Victorian-style building, or it had been once. Now it was a skeleton. The front gate was rusted shut. The garden had consumed the front path. 3 of the upstairs windows were missing entirely, covered with warped boards that had long since lost their grip. Nadya drove out there the first week, just to look at it. She sat in her car across the street for a long time. Then she called her best friend, a woman named Amara, and said, "My father hated me so much he left me a haunted house." Amara said, "Or he loved you so much he left you the one thing they didn't know how to steal." Nadya thought that was a very kind thing to say. She didn't believe it. Not yet. What changed everything was a phone call she received 3 weeks later. The caller was an old man named Mr. Haruna. He identified himself as someone who had worked for her father for over 20 years, not in the company, but personally. A fixer. A man who handled things Solomon didn't want handled through official channels. "Your father left you a message," Mr. Haruna said. "Not in the will. Somewhere else." "What do you mean?" "Go to the house," he said. "The real house. Go inside, look at what is still standing." He hung up before she could ask another question. She almost didn't go. The sensible part of her brain, the part that had been living in survival mode since the will reading, said this was some kind of trap. That Roland had paid someone to mess with her. That there was nothing in that house, except asbestos and heartbreak. But another part of her, the part that still remembered her father's hands and his laugh, and the way he used to say her name like it meant something, that part got in the car. Breaking into the house was easier than she expected. The back door had swollen in its frame but wasn't locked. She pushed it open with her shoulder and stepped into the kitchen. The smell hit her first. Damp, old wood, something sweet underneath like dried flowers or old paper. The kitchen had been stripped, counters gone, fixtures removed. But the bones of the room were intact, thick plaster walls, original tile floor cracked but present, a cast-iron stove someone had tried and failed to remove. She moved through the ground floor slowly, her phone torch illuminating patches of peeling wallpaper and exposed brick. The sitting room had a collapsed ceiling section in one corner. The dining room was empty except for a chandelier lying in pieces on the floor. Then she found the study. The door was heavier than the others, solid oak, original hardware. It swung open smoothly like it had been oiled recently. Inside, the room was different. Still old, still dusty, but intact. A desk, a chair, bookshelves along 2 walls still holding books. and on the desk, placed with obvious intention, a single sealed envelope. Her name was written on the front in her father's handwriting. She sat down in the chair, her father's chair, and she opened it. The letter was 4 pages long. She read it 3 times. By the time she finished the third reading, her hands were shaking. Not from grief, from understanding. Solomon Adami had known he was dying for almost a year before he died. And in that year, he had done something extraordinary. He had figured out what Miriam and Roland and Felix were planning. He had seen the manipulations for what they were, finally. Too late, but finally. An old friend had shown him a series of financial movements. Transfers made from his own accounts through a shell company Roland had set up 3 years earlier. By Solomon's estimate, Roland and Felix had already stolen close to $4 million from him before he was even in the ground. He had confronted Miriam. She had denied everything beautifully, convincingly. But something had broken in Solomon that day that could not be put back. He could not change the will openly. Roland had made himself a co-signatory on the legal accounts and had connections inside the law firm. Any obvious changes would be flagged, contested, potentially overturned. So Solomon did something else. He hid the real inheritance. He made it look like a punishment. He made it look like rejection. He gave Nadya the one thing nobody would think to fight over, because nobody would believe there was anything inside it worth fighting for. The ruined house. His letter told her exactly what to look for, where to look, and why every single thing he had done in the last year of his life had been building toward this moment. There were 2 questions Nadya needed to answer. First, was it still there? Hidden things can be found by the wrong people. Had Roland or Felix discovered any of this? Second, would any of it hold up legally? A dying man's hidden arrangements, a handwritten letter, assets concealed through deliberate misdirection. Was any of it enough to fight back with? She was going to need help, and she was going to need to be very, very careful. I need to stop here for a second, because if what Solomon did is what I think he did, this entire family is about to get the shock of their lives. Drop a comment right now. Did you see this coming? And if you are not subscribed yet, do it now, because what Nadya finds inside that house next will leave you speechless. The letter had given her instructions. She was to go to the basement. The house had a basement, unlisted on any current property documents, absent from the floor plans the estate lawyers had filed. This was not an accident. Solomon had paid a surveyor, years ago, to quietly omit it from the official records. In a city where property documentation was inconsistent and underfunded, it was easier than it sounds. Getting to it required moving the cast-iron stove in the kitchen, the one that seemed immovable. Solomon's letter explained that it rolled on a hidden rail, installed during a renovation 17 years ago. She would need to pull the left rear leg toward her and then push the entire unit clockwise. It took her 40 minutes and 2 broken nails, but it moved. Below the stove was a trapdoor. Below the trapdoor was a wooden staircase. Below the staircase was a room. She stood at the top of those stairs for a long time before she went down. The basement was dry. Sealed, ventilated through a system her father had installed. It was lit by a battery-powered strip light that turned on automatically when she reached the bottom step. Solomon had thought of everything. The room was not large, perhaps 20 feet by 15. And it was full, not cluttered. Full the way a mind is full, deliberately, purposefully, with specific things placed in specific ways. Along the left wall, filing cabinets. 4 of them labeled in her father's handwriting. Along the right wall, a safe, bolted to the concrete floor, combination given in the letter. In the center of the room, a folding table with 3 items on it. A laptop, old but functional, charged via a portable battery pack, a USB drive, and a second envelope. She opened the safe first. Inside were documents, Legal documents, property deeds, share certificates, all of them immaculate. All of them dated and notarized by a different lawyer, one in a different city, whose name Roland had never heard, who had no connection to the firm Miriam had cultivated so carefully. Her father, it turned out, had spent the last 8 months of his life conducting a second, parallel legal process, quietly, through an intermediary, under the guise of personal estate planning. What he had done was this. He had purchased, through a series of layered transactions that were completely legal but deliberately opaque, 11 additional properties across 3 cities. He had transferred the intellectual property rights to his original construction methodology, which was still actively licensed by companies in 4 countries, into a trust. He had opened 3 investment accounts, contributed to them steadily, and registered them under a holding company whose sole beneficiary was his daughter. The total value as of his last accounting was $61 million, not 43, 61. Roland and Felix had stolen a fraction of what they thought they were getting. The real estate of Solomon Adami, the actual weight of everything he had built, was sitting in a dry basement underneath a ruined house that nobody wanted, but the filing cabinets were what truly changed the story. Each one was labeled. The first one simply said, Roland, the second, Felix, the third, Miriam, the fourth, evidence. She opened the 4th cabinet first. It took her 3 hours to read through everything inside. Bank statements, emails printed and annotated in her father's handwriting, photographs, legal filings. Records of every transfer, every forged signature, every fraudulent document. Solomon Adami had spent the last year of his life building a case, not for himself. He knew he wouldn't live to see it through. For her, she sat on the basement floor at 1 in the morning with her back against the filing cabinet and cried for a long time. Not because she was sad exactly, but because she finally understood. He had not abandoned her. He had not chosen them over her. He had seen what was happening, and he had done the only thing he could do. He had hidden the truth somewhere safe, wrapped it in something that looked worthless, and trusted that she would find it. He had bet everything on his daughter. She spent the next 10 days moving carefully. She engaged a lawyer, not through any local firm, through a recommendation from Mr. Haruna, who turned out to be more connected than she had imagined. A woman named Adiz Obi, based in Lagos, with a reputation in complex estate litigation that made Roland's lawyers look like they were still in school. Together, they documented everything. They photographed the basement. They had the documents authenticated. They traced every transaction in Roland's shell company and found 3 more that Solomon's original investigation had missed. Adiz's assessment was straightforward. This was one of the most comprehensively documented cases of estate fraud she had ever seen. Solomon had essentially done her job for her. Your father was meticulous, she told Nadya. He was an engineer, Nadya said. He believed in building things that would last. The legal challenge was filed on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Roland knew. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Roland's legal team filed a counter-challenge the same day, claiming the hidden assets constituted a fraudulent attempt to circumvent the legitimate will, that the documentation was fabricated, that Nadya had coerced or manipulated a dying man. They contacted journalists. 2 newspapers ran stories suggesting Nadya was a troubled woman with a history of estrangement who was now trying to exploit her father's death. Felix called her. His voice was perfectly calm. You need to think very carefully about what you're doing, he said. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, she said. My father told me everything. Silence. Then the line went dead. That same week the house was broken into. Someone had gone through the study. Drawers pulled out, books thrown from shelves. They had found the trapdoor, or tried to. But Nadya had moved everything that mattered 2 days after she first found it. The basement was empty. The documents were in a secure location in 3 separate cities. The USB drive was with Adiz in Lagos. There was nothing to find, but the break-in told her something important. Roland was scared. The next move caught her completely off guard. Miriam called her, not through lawyers, personally. She asked to meet for coffee. She said she wanted to talk mother to daughter. She had never called Nadya her daughter before, not once in 30 years. Nadya almost didn't go. Amira told her not to go. Her lawyer told her absolutely not to go. She went. They met at a hotel cafe. Miriam looked older than the last time Nadya had seen her, or perhaps Nadya was simply seeing her more clearly now. Miriam's proposition was this: drop the legal challenge. Accept a settlement, $5 million, paid through a private arrangement, no lawyers, no courts, no publicity. Sign a document agreeing not to pursue the matter further. 5 million out of 61, Nadya said. It's a fair offer, Miriam said. For what you would have had legally. My father intended me to have all of it. Your father, Miriam said carefully, was not well at the end. You know this. Nadya looked at the woman who had dismantled her family from the inside, who had spent 30 years turning a grieving father against his child, who had sat in a lawyer's office and watched Nadya receive a deed to a ruin with a small, satisfied expression. I think we're done here, Nadya said and stood up. The next 2 months were the hardest of her life. Roland's legal team was expensive and ruthless. They filed motion after motion, challenged document after document, subpoenaed people from her past looking for anything that might discredit her. The media coverage was mostly negative. An anonymous source, she always assumed it was Felix, told a gossip site that Nadya had been cut out of her father's will because of her behavior, and the story ran without any fact-checking whatsoever. There were days she could barely get out of bed. There were days she drove to the ruined house and sat in the study, the room her father had preserved, the one room in the ruin that still stood intact, and just sat there in his chair, in the quiet, and tried to remember what she was fighting for. On one of those days, she found something she had missed the first time. It was small, taped to the underside of the desk drawer, a key, old brass with a number stamped on the head. It took her a week to identify it. It was a safe deposit box key. The number corresponded to a box at a bank branch in a town 2 hours away, a branch Solomon had never used for any of his visible accounts. Inside the box, one more document. A formal, witnessed, notarized letter from Solomon's secondary attorney, dated 4 months before his death, confirming his full legal capacity and sound mind at the time of all the hidden transfers. A preemptive answer to the only real legal argument Roland had left. Solomon had thought of everything. The case was heard over 4 days. Adiz Obi was extraordinary. She presented Solomon's documentation the way a mathematician presents a proof, step by step, undeniable, each element locking into the next. The shell company, the forged signatures, the transfers, the hidden assets and their legitimate construction over decades, the notarized letter confirming Solomon's mental capacity, the 4th filing cabinet and its contents. Roland's legal team objected to almost everything. The judge overruled them almost every time. On the second day, Felix asked for a recess and did not come back after lunch. His lawyer announced he was willing to cooperate with the court's proceedings. In plain terms, he was prepared to testify against his brother in exchange for reduced liability. Roland sat at the respondent's table and stared straight ahead. On the third day, the notarized mental capacity letter was admitted as evidence. This was the moment Roland's strategy collapsed. His entire counterargument had rested on the idea that Solomon had been manipulated while terminally ill and mentally compromised. That argument was now, legally, dead. His lawyers asked for a settlement meeting. Adiz declined. "We didn't come here to settle," she told them. "We came here to finish this." The ruling came on a Friday. The court found in Nadya's favor on all primary counts. The will, as executed through Roland's controlled legal channels, was found to have been executed under conditions of undue influence. The hidden estate, all $61 million of it, was ruled to be the legitimate inheritance of Nadya Ademi, as her father had clearly and legally intended. Roland was referred for criminal investigation on charges of financial fraud and document forgery. Miriam was named as a co-conspirator in the undue influence finding. Felix received a reduced judgment in exchange for his cooperation. The family company, the one with her father's name on it, would now need to be restructured. Nadya, as the court-appointed beneficiary of the controlling stake, would decide what happened to it. She didn't sell it. She renamed it. The Ademi Group is now run by Nadya. She hired the old CFO her father trusted before Miriam replaced him. She reinstated 4 employees Roland had fired in the years leading up to Solomon's death, and she renovated the house. Not demolished, renovated. It took 14 months. She moved in on a Saturday in November on what would have been her father's 68th birthday. The garden is restored. The front gate works. The upstairs windows have glass in them. The study, her father's study, is exactly as it was when she found it. She has added nothing, removed nothing. She uses it to work. She kept the cast-iron stove in the kitchen. She kept the trapdoor. She keeps the door to the basement locked. But sometimes she goes down there and sits with the empty filing cabinets and the empty safe and the folding table, and thinks about what her father built in secret while he was dying. What it cost him to trust her with it, what it means that he did. Nadya says she thinks about Miriam sometimes, not with anger or not only with anger, with something more like grief. Because Miriam had 30 years to be part of this family, 30 years to let things be different, and she chose, again and again, to take instead of give. She says she thinks about her father differently than she used to. She used to think the estrangement was his failure. Now she thinks it was his greatest act of love, keeping his distance so that Miriam couldn't use Nadya against him, making the separation look like rejection so that they wouldn't suspect what he was building in the silence between them. "He couldn't protect me while he was alive," she said in a recent interview. "So he built something that would protect me after he was gone, and he trusted me to find it." There is one part of this story that has never been fully explained. Among the documents in the 4th filing cabinet was a name that appeared in Solomon's handwritten notes as someone who had helped Roland set up the original shell company. Someone inside the law firm, someone who had access to Solomon's accounts and had used that access to give Roland an advantage. That person was never charged. The investigation is, as of this recording, still open, and Nadya has said quietly that she knows who it is, and that she is not finished. Solomon Ademi trusted a ruined house to carry the truth. He trusted his daughter to understand what he couldn't say out loud. And he trusted that love, real love, the kind that plans and protects and hides things in basements, is stronger than greed. He was right. I want to know what you think. Who is the unnamed person in that filing cabinet? And do you think Nadya should go after them or let it be? Drop your answer in the comments right now. This story has hundreds of thousands of people talking, and I want to hear from you. If this hit you the way it hit me, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because part 2 of this story is coming. And trust me, the name in that file cabinet is going to shock you all over again.